Back in the day, most kids were pretty limited to how many video games they could play. So if we wanted to play more than just what we had to be resourceful. And one of the best ways of doing this was, of course, by borrowing video games from other people. Now, this was all sunshine and roses until some kid decided, hey, I'm gonna upgrade from borrowing this game to permanently borrowing this game. Now, the question that I'm here in this video to ask is whether or not permanently borrowing a game is a scam or an art form. Well, depending which side of the fence you've been on, your opinion probably will differ. But I think in a lot of cases, it has more to do with just carelessness more than anything else. Personally, I've never been on either side of the fence when it comes to permanently borrowing games. After all, I mean, it is essentially stealing, so I would never condone it. But with that being said, I'm not going to judge you for what you did years and years ago, and I know this sort of thing happened left and right back then. So with that being said, this video is your chance to either brag about a permanent borrow you're proud of that you pulled off against some kid you feel deserved it back in the day, or to complain about being the victim of a permanent borrow that you're still bitter about to this day because that jerk kid has your game, or, you know, by now probably sold it or did who knows what with it. Okay, so first let's go over one of the most common ways that a permanent borrow occurs. And let me just throw a classic example at you here. Okay, so there's some kid in your neighborhood and you're sort of friends with him. He lives somewhere down the street and, you know, one day he decides to borrow a video game from you. You're nice enough to let him borrow a video game. And you think, yeah, I don't know him that well, but he only lives, down the street. What can he do? Well, what he can do is he can move away without telling you. And then one day you go over there and there's some strange people on his front lawn and you think, this isn't Timmy and his mom. And then it occurs to you, that son of a bagel never gave me my game back. But then here's the key follow-up question. Was it intentional on his part? Or did he just forget he had it? Well, that would be awfully convenient, wouldn't it? I think one of the biggest factors at play here is how well did you know that kid? If it's one of your best friends, then odds are you're probably seeing that kid a lot, and it's gonna be on your mind that they have your game, and you're gonna remember to ask for it back. They're gonna remember to give it back, and if they're any kind of friend at all, they're not going to want to screw you. If it's a kid that you didn't know very well, then that's where the problems can start to occur. Because, like I said, you don't see them very often, so it's not going to be on your mind to ask for it back. And kids are just careless with their things. You're not going to remember what you loaned out. I mean, most kids can barely keep track of what's in their own room. Once you start taking stuff outside of the house, kids are not the best candidates to be keeping track of their stuff. But now let's go inside the mindset of a kid who is trying to intentionally permanent borrow a game, just for fun. Okay, so there's three key factors that need to fall into place for this to go smoothly. The first thing is, like I said before, it needs to be a kid that you don't know very well. The second thing is that they need to be someone who doesn't really care about their video games very much. So a spoiled kid is often gold for this because they have tons of games that their parents just kind of give them. They don't mean as much to them. They maybe have some games they didn't even want, and so they will be less likely to notice they're missing or, possibly care at all. And the third factor is you need to have a scenario where you are never going to see them again for one reason or another. And you know what? The perfect scenario really that comes right off the top of my head is a summer camp or some type of camp. Because think about it, it's perfect. It's just enough to know the kid well enough that they would trust you so you can borrow the game. Lots of kids who go to camp, often their parents have money because camp is expensive, so there's probably definitely some spoiled kids at that camp. And then the third thing, never gonna see them again? Yeah, once camp is done, you're never gonna see them again, assuming they don't go to the same school as you or something like that. So yeah, camps, those were the bread and butter for a lot of kids trying to intentionally permanent borrow games. So from that perspective, it could be viewed as an art form, but let's take a look at things from the scam perspective, which, if we're being honest, every single permanent borrow is a scam. I mean, come on, stealing is wrong. Certain permanent borrows are definitely extra malicious. There's just no way around it. Like I've been talking about, if it was somebody you actually did know really well and they permanently borrowed your game and potentially even on purpose, then that's definitely screwed up. One of the dirtier tricks when it comes to permanent borrowing is, when kids lie about having lost the game so that then they don't have to give it back. I actually witnessed this firsthand. One of my friends was borrowing some other kid's game, or I can't remember which way it was. But so anyways, the kid who had lied about losing the game, I was over at his house one day and I'm like, hey, here's that game you said you lost. And they're like, oh my goodness, how did you find it? And it's like, yeah, I'm a regular Sherlock Holmes. It was right underneath the TV with all the other games. So yeah, that was a obvious situation of that kid lying about having lost the game. What a turd. All right, so by this point you may be thinking, but what about the situations where both kids get to borrow a game? I mean, that's kind of a safer way to go because it's almost like a security deposit in a way where each kid is holding the other kid's game, so there's more of an incentive to at some point get those games exchanged back. Now, in theory, this is the best method that I would recommend, but that doesn't mean things can't still go awry. And the way that this can occur is what I like to call the old bait and switch. Essentially, what happens is when the kids go to exchange games and trade one game for the other that they're going to borrow, one of the kids thinks, hey, what game could I live without so that, say these games never get traded back, I'll be making out on the good side. And so in a way, you're almost kind of sacrificing away a game that either you don't really like or you don't care about anymore. You're willing to sacrifice that game in hopes of the potential that you'll get to keep the other kid's game and it'll be worth it. A good trade. Now, if it turns out that both kids each really like the game they're borrowing better than the one they gave away, and they decide mutually, hey, yeah, let's just hang on to the games we have now, then that's a good trade and that's fair and nobody gets screwed. But if one of the kids is intentionally planning on not giving it back, even though the other kid wants to trade the games back at some point, and then, they move away or don't tell them or say they lost it or any of that kind of nonsense, then you fall right back into that scam territory. In most cases, for a permanent borrow to be pulled off successfully, somebody has to forget to ask for a game back. But you know who doesn't forget to ask for a game back? Rental stores. I remember some kids bragging back in the day for renting a game out from Blockbuster or wherever it was, and then just never giving it back. So essentially, they got the game for whatever the rental fee was. But the thing is, they were bragging just 2 days after they had decided to not give it back. And sure enough, a couple days later, the rental store calls them up and says, yeah, you need to give it back, and there's extra fees due for it being late. So that kid's parents were pissed off and it was a lose-lose situation. And that about does it for my thoughts when it comes to permanent borrows. But of course, I know a lot of you have experience with this. I mean, this stuff was widespread and rampant back in the day. I know that a lot of you have stories and I can't wait to hear it about that one game you permanent borrowed or had permanent borrowed from you. Or, goodness forbid, a console. Oh my goodness, I can't even imagine that. But so be sure to leave those stories down in the comments. I really want to read them, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's